One of the things that you would mention when you first started with in your book, when you're talking about publishing some of this sort of like different way of doing science around plants, was that you had discovered that plants communicate in a way that doesn't include light or chemicals, and that upon publishing the paper, or attempting to publish the paper, despite sort of the reliability or the legitimacy of what you had sort of discovered, that you came up against a lot of resistance. And one of the things that you got resistance against, if I remember correctly, was that you didn't have an established theory about why and what before, presenting what you discovered, and that you were basically said, well, this isn't good science, or this is not how science is done. You have to have a theory before you do any investigation. And then there was also a sense that maybe that was a way in which it was delegitimizing an inconvenient discovery about plants, for example. Can you talk a little bit about the, again, going back to what you were mentioning before, anthropocentrism, the anthropocentric bias that showed up as a reluctance or a straight up resistance to accepting the legitimacy of your research?
Yeah, well, that was I remember exactly what you're referring to, because it was one of the first papers that I published on plants. And it was one of the first studies. And the reason why I did it was because, for me, the idea that plant communication was actually already a research field was like, oh my God, wow, I didn't know that. And I didn't know anything about plants. So I started reading what was done and being as an animal ecologist, right? So an animal researcher looking in what plant researchers are doing. And it was like, wow, there is all of these chemical communication research done, which is beautiful. Then there is light. Oh, and we know that, if the roots touch each other, they can also share and communicate information. So those three elements, touch, light, and chemical, were, quite well developed. And it was very clear, like, yeah, plants use these senses to communicate. But coming from the animal perspective, like a lot of the work in the animal world is about sound. And I was like, and they haven't looked at the obvious. It's like, well, we are all embedded in sound one way or another. And so why is there nothing on sound? So I started digging, of course. And of course, I ended up in the literature of the 60s, 70s with The Secret Mind of Plants and all of that kind of stuff, which it's a double-edged sword, because it was great that there was someone that already, suggested that. And of course, before them, Darwin himself used to play his oboe or whatever he was playing to his plants, and he was convinced that the plants were listening. So, the fact that modern evolutionary biology was playing music to his plants, I think that there must be something. But again, that was actually it was good to see that, but also was the very problem that I had to face, because science had already discarded that. It already decided that this work wasn't really scientifically done, which I agree. And so, it doesn't have any scientific validity. Like, anybody can say that the plants are listening to music, but this is not science. Where is the science? So it's like, okay, so let's do the science and see what happens. But before I got to that, so I started suspecting that, I started thinking, like, how cool would it be if we find that plants are responding to sound? And it intuitively made sense that they might do. And so I started exploring on two fronts. On one front, I wanted to see what other fields of research and other bodies of knowledge had to say about this, about sound, the relationship between sound and plants. And on the other side, I thought, okay, let's say that it's not sound. It could be anything, actually. What if we block the communication channels that we know plants are using? So the light, the touch, and the chemistry. In theory, if these are the only channels that they're using, there should be no other channels available, and so they won't know who is growing next to them. But if they're using something else, and sound could be one of the vehicles for that communication, then they should be able to talk to each other or communicate and know who is growing next to them without those 3 channels that we are aware of. And so the experiment was like, I built these matryoshka boxes. And so there was one plant inside a box, and then within that there was another box and other plants around. And the setup was designed so that it would block a different time. There would be no access to light, or access to light but no chemistry, or access to none of them, or different combinations. And what I found that when I closed all the channels, the 3 channels that we knew about, the plants still knew exactly what was going on, and they still could tell who was growing next to them. And so how did they know? And that was what disturbed the reviewers of my paper, because usually we start with the question and then we find the answer. That's how we are expected to work. But for me, so the question is the hypothesis, the theory, and then, we go and use that to test. But for me, the question was like, do these channel that we know of for communicating, are they the only way in which plants are communicating? And the design wasn't designed to find anything. It was just to test whether, is there more? But it's so vague, it's so uncomfortable, the idea that there might be more. And if we don't know what that more is, that's not comfortable. The reviewer had the problem. It's like, well, that's all well and good, but what is it? And if you didn't, one of the comments that was made, which is funny, the reviewer accused me of doing this study with no design, and then kind of randomly finding that the plants could do something else, that it wasn't what we already knew. And so then I brought the paper backwards. It's like, because I found something strange, then I decided to make it as if I already planned it that way. And I was like, oh my God, this is so complicated that I wouldn't be able to design it that way. It's too complicated for me to design it that way. It was much easier to just ask the simple question of, is this all we know? And is this all that is there? And if there is more, can we see it? And even if we don't know what that more is, can we just ask the question of, is there more? Is there something else?